Hi, my name is Leah Day, and this is the video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Today we're going to learn binding. We're finishing off our quilt. This is the last step, and we're going to bind the edges completely by machine. We might have a little bit of hand stitching just to keep those corners in nice control and make sure they're nice and crisp, but for the most part, this is a method that's done entirely by machine, and it's a lot faster and easier to do than hand binding. So let's get started. The first step in this process is to prepare your binding. I cut my binding 2 inches wide and then fold it in half and press. Here's 2 very important tips. Before cutting these strips, I starch the fabric, and after pressing in that fold, I starch the strip again. And you want to be very careful not to stretch it and skew it when you're starching, but that extra layer of starch along this binding will really keep it under control and easy to work with. I really advise doing that. The other thing that we're going to do is work from the back of the quilt. Whenever we're sewing the binding on, the very first step, I'm going to be sewing on the back, and then we're going to roll it around to the front. One thing you're going to want to make sure to do, any extra, those connecting binding pieces, they extend out beyond the quilt. You want to trim that off so that the edges of the quilt are nice and square. And then one thing that I like to do is just go around, and as you're kind of laying out your binding, make sure that the area of seam allowance where we connected the binding strips together, make sure that this join does not end up right on a corner, because that can be a real pain to turn that and deal with the miter and all of that nonsense. It can be really, really tricky if that seam ends up on the corner. So just kind of lay out your quilt and find a good arrangement. And I have found, I've already laid everything out, and I have found that I want to start right here along this edge with my binding like this. And here's the other tip. You want at least 12 inches of extra strip that is just unquilted. And one nice rule of thumb is you could just lay it on the block, and about 1.5 blocks you need to have just loose. So I'm going to lay this here, and I'm going to start my stitching about right here, making sure I have all this loose, and this will allow me to connect the beginning and end point of my binding together. So let's take it from here, get it on the machine, and start stitching. Okay, so at this point I'm just going to lift the foot. I've got my binding in place. I am using just my 1/4 inch foot, and this is just the way I do it, I should say. A lot of people bind with their walking foot, and I think that's certainly a good method to use if you need to. There's something about this particular foot on this particular machine that I find that this is available to me, that I'm able to use it. I think it's something about the pressure of the foot and how it feeds the fabric. It's just right. I'm able to feed it through, and I don't feel a need to use a walking foot. So I'm going to stitch forward and back stitch. I really want that locked in and secure. One other thing, I have lowered my stitch length to 1.5 millimeters, so I'm getting a very nice, tiny, tight stitch. It's super important because it's definitely going to guarantee that these stitches are locked in and securing this edge. So basically, as you stitch the binding onto the back, you're just making sure, what you're mostly concentrating on is just that this edge stays in alignment, that the edge of the binding and the edge of the quilt stay in nice alignment with one another, and that you're stitching an accurate 1/4 inch seam. If you want to go either way, go under a 1/4 inch, but don't go, try not to go over. Whenever you go over, that things kind of stop working as well. So I'm going to get down to this corner, and that's where really kind of the tricky part of binding comes into play. Down here, I'm going to already start my game plan, about right there. At this point, I really want to know where the edge of the quilt is underneath this binding. So I just take it, fold it up, and just do a finger press right there on that edge. I'm just getting myself a crease line, just like that. The next thing that I'll do is mark that crease line. I'm just using my Fons & Porter ceramic marking pencil. And then you can either eyeball it, or you can grab a ruler. I happen to have a ruler next to me today. And you can grab a ruler and just measure up 1/4 of an inch from that first mark, from that fold, measure up 1/4 of an inch. And we're going to stitch to that 1/4 of an inch mark. You don't want to stitch beyond it. So right about one more stitch. There we go. And then I back stitch. And then you can rotate and just stitch right off that edge. And I like to use a scrap charger. It just keeps everything nice and clean. I just stitch onto that little scrap. Okay. Okay, so here's our stitching line running down. We did a back stitch here, and then I just simply rotated and stitched right off. At this point, the binding is just coming straight down. So what I want to do is just take it and fold it to the right. And that creates this 45-degree angle right here. And I finger press that in. This is why it's so nice to have this binding stiff and starched, is I can finger press this and get a really solid finger press. It's really nicely creased. Okay, so that's pressed in place just like that. Now I take the binding and fold it back to the left, creating that nice straight fold along the edge, right along the edge. Perfect. Okay, so when I start stitching, I can start stitching right here, right off the edge, 1/4 of an inch from the edge of that corner down here. I'm going to start stitching right along, and I want to back stitch right here to make sure it's secure. So let's take this to the machine and get started. Okay, here we go. If you need to, of course, you can pin this in place. I find that the pins usually get in my way, so I don't like to pin. I'm just going to lift up the foot kind of high. I'm doing that with my knee lifter, but you can easily reach back and lift up your foot pretty high. Get it on top of all of those layers. And then your first stitches should be right on top. Back stitch. And keep stitching down. So at this point, you're going to repeat those same steps, working around all 4 corners of the quilt. Stitch up to that corner, back stitch, stitch off. Make sure that you're not going beyond that 1/4 of an inch right on that corner. Do those folds. Review that part of the video so you understand how that fold works. And then start stitching and make sure to back stitch again. This is what ensures that that corner is very solid. Those stitches are not going to come out. They've been back stitched, they've been secured. So repeat those steps with the 4 corners, and then make sure to stop when you're stitching your binding on that last edge. Make sure to stop at least 12 inches from where you started stitching your binding. That's going to allow you more than enough room to connect these pieces together. Okay, so I'm right here at the end. I'm getting close to where I started binding, and I just wanted to show you how much space I'm leaving. A full block and a half is the amount of space that I think is really essential for making this easy. And I'm just going to stitch up, back stitch, and then take the quilt off the machine. Okay, and looking at it here, yes, you're going to have some extra binding. And for some reason mine ended up where I have this seam allowance right here from where I'm connecting the binding together. I really don't want that to be right up next to my join with the first start of my binding, so I'm going to cut off. This is a little short than what I usually do, but it's going to work. I'm going to cut it off there. I really don't want that seam to be messing everything up for me. So this was cut a little long. That's okay. You can. I always kind of save all my extra binding, leftover binding in one bin, and it's quite useful. You can bind up scrappy quilts with it very, very fast. Okay, so this piece goes down first. And like I said, I would normally cut it longer, but I was trimming off. I had that seam allowance. That's why I've cut it short. And I want this to be very smooth and flat on the surface of the quilt. I'm going to run my fingers over it several times. Now I'm going to take the top binding, this is where we started quilting, and I'm going to smooth this out on top. Just spreading and smoothing carefully. You almost want this to be just a little bit of tension, so sometimes I'll just reach in and just pull on both bindings just ever so slightly. Just put a little tension on it, not a lot, just a little, so that I know that this is 100% straight and flat, and it's not going to end up baggy. I'm not going to end up with a pleat in it when it's all done. Okay, so these two pieces are overlapped here, and I want to place a pin, a marking pin, so that I know exactly where they're overlapping. So I'm just picking a random spot, just, you know, here's the edge of one binding, here's the edge of the other, it's kind of right in the middle, and I'm placing one pin into basically the fold of the bottom binding. Let me zoom in and you can really see this. I'm placing one pin into the fold of that bottom binding. Get aligned again. Here I had to shift the quilt around, so I'm making sure I'm back in alignment. Now I'm going to place my second pin in the fold of the top binding. I'm not actually pinning these two together. See, they're separate. I'm just marking that little spot. So now, I always have to kind of remind myself of how to do this every time I do it. I'm going to take the top binding, the binding that we ended with, and I always just take that pen and pop it in sideways, just like this. And I'm going to place this, and I'm going to place this with that fold side up, facing up. I'm going to fold the quilt basically in half right here. That usually makes this a lot more manageable. Okay, now I'm going to take this one and place it fold side down on top of the first binding. And this is where it comes in. It's kind of nice to have this folded over so that way the two bindings are kind of closer together. Okay, grab one more straight pin, and I'm going to insert it right where that top piece, where that midpoint, that pin is marking, and I'm going to run it down to exactly where the second pin was marking. Let me zoom in, you can really see this. So I'm inserting it right in that fold where that pin is marking, and right in the fold where that pin is marking. Okay, so all that's nice. I want to make sure it's nice and aligned. I want to make sure that these two pieces of binding are perpendicular to each other, which means that they make this plus sign. Okay, now I can take out my original two pins. I'm leaving this one in place, making sure it's nice and square and that these two pieces are perfectly lined up. Okay, that looks good. Now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and this is the part that I always kind of got wrong. And if you look at it this way, which direction do you think you should stitch it? It's a diagonal seam, so that way our seam allowances aren't too bulky. And when I first started stitching, I would always stitch this way, and I would end up with things twisted and not right. So it's always stitching from left to right, just like that. If you need to, you can take this and put a ruler over it and mark it with a ruler. So leave that pin in place, make sure that your strips are perfectly perpendicular to each other, and mark that line. That can be very, very helpful if you have that line marked. I usually don't take this pin out until the very, very last minute. Just start stitching. Kind of slide the pin down a little bit. And your marking might not be 100% perfect simply because that pin was in your way. That's okay. Just try and keep the line as straight as possible as you stitch from that corner to corner where these lines, pieces match up. So there's our stitch seam, and you really want to double check yourself before you trim this seam allowance, before you start messing with this, because if this is wrong, if you've twisted something, if this is not joined up properly, then you will still have enough binding to do it right. However, if you cut it, it's shot, and you'll have to maybe rip some out and put in a new piece of binding in order to have enough length to get these pieces together. So make sure to double check yourself. This is what you're looking for, a nice flat, smooth finish along this edge. And this looks great to me. Open this out and finger press open. And then I usually don't bother to go to the ironing board for this little seam. I usually just trim it off, finger press it open, fold my binding back up. I'm usually in such a hurry. By the time I'm binding, I just get it done, get it done, get it done. So I don't like to take it all the way to the ironing board to press it open. Okay, so there's that folded, and you can really get in there and finger press, making sure that that's open. And the reason I do these diagonal seams on the binding is it really reduces the bulk. It makes it a lot easier to bind, and it has a nicer finish. Okay, I have just an ever so slight bit of bagginess I could have worked out just a little bit by bringing those strips, those binding strips in just a little tighter together, but I think that this is fine. Just understand, every time you bind, you get kind of a different experience. But, you know, your goal is not too tight where it's squishing, kind of pulling and cinching the quilt up, but not so loose that you're going to have a pleat. And so now what's left for this first step of binding is to stitch from this point to this point and seal up this edge so it's completely finished. Now I have clearly some bagginess here, and I hate to admit it, but it happens to me even. The reason that this happened is I did not get my binding, those layers, quite straight and flat enough. I was kind of in a hurry and rushing through it, and I should have taken more time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of pinch right there, and it's really, I'm only getting bagginess on kind of one half of that binding, and I'm going to pinch it and intentionally put a pleat in it. Just like that, and I'm going to stitch over it. It's good to see. This happens even to me, and there is a way of hiding it. You can also kind of give the block a little tug, just that edge of the quilt, just a little tug, and that can often sort it out. And then keep stitching on down, back stitch when you're done. So I have this little pleat on this side, but if you flip it over, it's completely smooth on the opposite side. So keep that little cheat in mind. You might need to use it someday. You know, all this was just simply a little extra fabric where those two strips connected. Had I brought them just a little closer together, this wouldn't have happened. So that's it for stitching on the very first step of binding. We worked around the perimeter of the quilt, hitting all of those corners, doing that little fold, but stitching down the binding to the back side of the quilt. Now it's time to pull that binding up around the edge to the front and secure it, and I'm just going to use a straight stitch on my machine to secure it, so this can work on any sewing machine. I want to show you though a quick tip about the corners. You can finish the corners by machine too, but I like to just pick up a needle and do a little hand stitching to get all of those areas planned out in advance so that way they're easier and faster to stitch on the machine. So let me show you this tip. Okay, so we're ready to bind the corners of our quilt, and I always like to kind of plan out this area and do this fold. This is a mitered fold. From the back, this is what this looks like right now. This is how we folded it, how we stitched it in place. So what we want to do right now is unfold. Simply take the binding and pull it out and around and to the front of the quilt. You want to kind of squish that seam. If you want to take scissors or seam ripper and really kind of nudge into that seam. So here's a seam ripper. I'm not going to be poking at it, I'm just pressing. So you can see after pressing that seam ripper in there, that looks a lot more crisp. Okay, so now how do we fold this top side so that it looks as good as the bottom side? Well, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of feel this corner, and I can feel I've got extra seam allowance here. That lets me know that that side's the side I'm going to fold down first. I'm going to take this and just finger press it over. Just like this. and kind of press it down onto the table. That's really helpful. And this should make a 45-degree angle right here. Mine's getting a little wobbly bobbly, but that's pretty much a 45-degree angle right there. Okay? If you want to, go ahead and pin it in place. I'm just going to hold that and pin in place right there. Just like that. Okay, now I'm going to take this seam, and it really is nice to kind of hold a pen right here as you fold this edge over. Just like this. And if all the stars have aligned, then you will have a beautiful miter, a 45-degree fold right here, right in line with the 45-degree fold on the back. Okay, and I'm going to pin also to hold that in place. And so really that fold, that's what you want to do on all of the corners of your quilt, just to kind of prep them up and have them ready to go. If you really want this to hold securely and look beautiful, just absolutely perfect in your finished quilt, here's what you do. Needle and thread, just the same thread that we've been using for piecing and binding your quilt. And I just insert it and go all the way to the tip of the quilt. I just have an overhand knot securing it at the end. And now I'm just going to take a little bite out of the binding. Zoom in even more so hopefully you can see this without going fuzzy. Little bite out of the binding on the bottom, a little bite out of the binding, the fold on top. Just little bites. Now a little bite out of the binding on the bottom. It's usually only about 5 or 6 stitches. It's not a lot of anything. Little bite out of that fold. And one last, looks like I've got about 2 more stitches. And then grab that little edge right there. And then just stab straight through the quilt to the opposite side. So we've got that nicely secured. That's all held in place. And now on this opposite side, and I ended up just a little further away from that corner than I wanted to be, so I'm going to take a little stitch over. You can do the same thing, just a little bite out of the fold. So that is how I prep my corners. Just a little hand stitching, and that's going to hold that in place. Now I can put this on the machine and stitch right down on top of my folded edge. So when it comes to starting to stitch down this edge, it really doesn't matter where you start, except that, you know, you should start on an edge, not right smack dab on a corner. So I'm going to start right here about 1 block from the corner. And again, this might be a place that you want to use a walking foot. This might be a place that you want to use an edge stitching foot. It is entirely up to you what foot feels most comfortable for you. Like I said before, there is something about this particular machine that I find that my regular 1/4 inch patchwork foot is just so handy. So I don't feel a need to change feet. But you may, so definitely play with a couple different feet and see which one works out the best for you. So what I'm doing here is I'm just nicely folding that binding over, making sure that when I'm making sure it hits, we have a stitching line, and it's very dark, so it's probably hard to see it. We have a stitching line where I secured the binding in the first place, that 1/4 inch seam line. I'm making sure that the binding is folding over and almost completely covering. I want it completely covering that line of stitching. Don't want to see it. I want the binding to completely cover it. And it'd be really nice if it could stretch even over, you know, a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch. That'd be great. But it really just depends on how much give there is in the binding and how accurate the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance was. If you feel like it's not going to look pretty on the back of the quilt, so here's what it's looking like on the back of the quilt. You are going to have, you know, periods where the binding stitches through and you can see it. You're going to have periods where it stitches off the quilt so you can't see it. If you don't like this effect, if it, you know, seems a little just a little unreliable for you, if you don't like the look of it, you can always hand stitch this binding down completely. It's using that same kind of, you know, a bite here and a bite there hand stitching that we did when we were working on this corner. Okay, so I'm coming up to the corner and I've got just a little bagginess here, so I'm just kind of giving that corner just a little tug. I'm not yanking on it, I'm just giving a little bit of tension in that area as I stitch down to that area. I'm going to stop with my needle in the down position right when I get on that miter, and then rotate. Remove my pen and start folding the binding over and prepping the side. So you're just going to work around all of the corners the exact same way, and right now I'm fussing with, I've got just a lot of straight threads that are poking through. You can just kind of tuck them in there or you can clip them off. It's totally up to you. Okay, now start stitching. The corners are where you want to slow down and just take your time. But that little extra bit of hand stitching, I swear, it really does save you an enormous amount of time and hassle, because trying to do that fold right here in that tight corner right there on the machine, it's quite tricky. So it really does save you some time to take that extra 5 minutes and hand stitch those corners down, and it also has a much better, more secured effect for your quilt. It just looks good. So I'm just going to continue stitching on down just like this, running my stitching line just a little along that edge, that folded edge, securing it down, understanding that you might see some of it on the back side of the quilt. You might see it, you know, kind of pop on and pop off of that back edge. If you prefer, you could do a buttonhole stitch. You know, you could also try a zigzag stitch. You could try any of the decorative stitches on your machine. I really want you to feel an openness with binding your quilt to try different things. I'm using my piecing foot to bind this. I've used it throughout, you know, the connection process. However, I know that not all piecing feet are made equally. I could not have used the piecing foot on my Janome machine, for example, the same way. And that's not to say that it's a bad foot or anything, it's just something about the pressure and the way the foot is designed and the way the machine uses that foot. I can't explain it, all I know is it works. So that's what I use. I encourage you to play with this binding as you go through. Try different feet. Don't expect perfection if this is your very, very first time binding. You know, my first binding, I can show it to you. It was not perfect at all. I had no idea even what I was doing when I was binding my quilt. But it comes with experience and practice and trying different things before you can say, ah, this is what works, this is what I'm going to use. And I really hope that that's what this whole project has been about. I really hope that you have tried tons of new things. We've learned how to piece and free motion quilt 42 blocks. We've learned how to connect them together, and now we've learned how to bind our finished quilt so that we have finished this entire project together. I really hope that you have learned loads about this whole quilting process. I have absolutely enjoyed teaching you every step of the way, and I can't wait to share another quilt along with you next year. So my name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. You can still find the Building Blocks quilt pattern available at leahday.com, which comes with a complete set of quilting and piecing instructions for 42 blocks. Put them all together and make a beautiful quilt and learn loads along the way. Pick up your pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt.